Welcome to the 16th edition of SaaS Talks. And again, just to emphasize again, this is actually a discussion. This is not a panel. This is not about a rags to riches story. This is just discussing a particular topic, usually a functional topic, and what you can do within that sort of particular domain of function. Learning some best practices from other different people. In each of these editions, we have one or two anchor guests, and I'm going to introduce the anchor guests for this session soon. And the intent is that Arpit and I, we will sort of run the first 10, 12 minutes of the discussion to set the tone. But thereafter, it is actually an open discussion. Of course, the web format only allows for we can't all be around the table physically, but anybody can ask question, anybody can answer question. And given the topic that we are going to discuss today, I know that there is nobody on the call today who doesn't have some level of exposure or expertise on the topic of webinars itself. And therefore, if some of you actually manage marketing function or have a lot of experience with this, feel free to put your hands up and we will actually like to bring you in into the screen itself, like we have done in so many different editions. So with that, let me first introduce the topic. And the background to this topic is that last week I was actually having lunch with Khadim, who is the founder of Whatfix. And sorry, my daughter is behind me, but thank God I have a virtual background today. So I was meeting Khadim for lunch, and he mentioned to me today saying that, Alok, one of the things that we have done really well is the use of webinars. And I was actually a little bit perplexed, and I asked him a few more questions. But he talked to me about how life has completely changed since COVID started. And I know that webinar is not a new topic, or demand gen is not a new topic. All of you have done this experiences in your past. But something in the world has also changed in the last 15 months. Many of us will also claim that we are tired of webinars, not SaaS Talks, but I mean all the other webinars. So the intent of this discussion is that what can you do to make your webinars more effective? And it's not just webinars, it can be actually any online meeting format. It can be actually much larger format. It can be one-to-one, it can be one-to-few, it can be one-to-many. It can be in demand gen, it can be later part of the sales cycle. There are all those sort of various permutations and combinations in which this, and I'm going to continue to use the word webinar for the lack of any better phrase that at least I have in my kitty. And with that, let me introduce the two anchor guests today. So Gokul, he heads field marketing for Whatfix. And Gokul, as you can imagine, the moment Khadim talked about it, I was tempted to come to you. Interestingly, Gokul, at least as far as I can remember, was the first marketing hire at Whatfix. This goes back to late 2014, early 2015 is what I recollect, when at least I thought we didn't even know what marketing meant for SaaS. In those days. And I don't think there is an aspect of marketing that Gokul has not been introduced to or been an expert of. So Gokul, welcome to SaaS Talks. Nitin.
Thanks, Alok.
Thank you for joining, Gokul. Nitin is the co-founder and CEO of Pando. And Nitin also I have now known for many years. One of the entrepreneurs I truly admire a lot. And I'll tell you why. Also, at least when I started investing in SaaS, the classical recipe had always been SMB, low-end US remote sales. And here comes Nitin in an old world industry like logistics, targeting the large enterprise, starting with India, but he has done a fabulous job of building Pando. Many global customers are now customers of Pando as well. And he and I have been chatting regularly over the years, exchanging thoughts on many different topics. And again, I requested Nitin to therefore join as well. So Nitin, thank you so much for being here as well.
Good to be here, Alok.
Great. So while I'll start with my questions soon, as I said, a note to the audience, we will only try to take the first 10 to 11 minutes. Thereafter, it's going to be an open discussion. My only request is, when you ask questions, put them in the Q&A panel, not in the chat panel, number one. Number two, you can raise your hand. We'll actually bring you in. That's also a perfectly legitimate, or I would say even a more interesting way to ask the question. Lastly, keep your questions relevant to the topic and not to other topics. We will, I'm sure, at some point begin to repeat topics as well. So with that, Nitin, let me actually begin with you first. I'm sure that you have used webinars in the context of Pando as well for different purposes, and I'm assuming for demand generation as well. I'm curious to understand at what stage of the user journey, at what point do you begin to propose or nudge the prospect to join a webinar? And how successful has that been as a channel of demand gen for you?
Right. Look, thanks for having me. So one quick disclaimer before that, right? I'm here as much to learn from Gokul and the rest of you as I talk about what's worked and what's not worked for Pando. And it's been I would say about a year's journey for Pando through what you defined as sort of 1:1 or 1:many or many sort of asynchronous online engagements, right? That I would sort of broadly define as webinars. And we've also looked to other startups, both in India, SaaS companies, both in India and globally, to figure out what webinars mean for Pando in the context of Pando, right? So I'll also, through today's conversation, talk about some of those companies that have done a good job of building community and content around online engagement, right? So the question is, can we use, what do we use webinars for, right? I think fundamentally, I think webinars are probably amongst the highest return yielding investments in a SaaS marketer's arsenal, right? And probably, at least at Pando, one of the least understood, or at least the least used till 12 to 15 months back, right? So do we use them at Pando? Absolutely. Have we gotten better at it? The data says so. Are we quote unquote there yet compared to where we want to be? I don't think so. What do we use webinars for? So, we had this discussion a year back, 6 months back, and then most recently, a week back at Pando. And my view is actually, you can actually use webinars for anything and everything in your user journey or your buyer journey, right? So you can use webinars to generate demand. You can use webinars to generate leads. You can use webinars to, educate a cold prospect. You can use webinars to influence a lead towards your buying decision that you want them to take. You can use webinars also to assist or sort of accelerate the buying cycle overall, right? Or to get customers to reference or recommend you to other prospects once you've sort of brought them on board, right? It's also interesting because one thing that we don't use webinars for, so all of this stuff we use webinars for at Pando today, right? Which is all before the buying decision or before they decide to come on board Pando. More and more, we've started thinking about how we can use webinars to onboard customers, how we can use webinars to get customers to use Pando effectively and deliver value from Pando, right? We've also started thinking about how we can use webinars to expand revenue or influence customers to expand revenue for Pando, and in turn deliver more value to these customers as well, right? So that piece of customer success webinars or content and community around customer success, we actually don't use webinars for today at Pando, but we're actively thinking about it and have a point of view on that as well, right? So that's my answer, right? So this might be sort of, in a nutshell, do it for everything. But the reality is, I think the way, again, I sort of think about it is, in the growth journey of a SaaS startup, I think 0 to 3 million, 3 to 10 million, 10 to 30, I think your sales process and your onboarding process fundamentally evolves, right? It's not the user journey and the buyer journey from prospect to customer to expansion, which is, let's say, not a funnel, but a bow tie, if you would, of customers moving through that journey, fundamentally evolves, right? So at whatever stage you are in the SaaS growth journey, if you have clarity about your buyer journey for that stage, whichever stages you have clarity on, I would actually go ahead and invest in targeted online events or webinars for each of those stages of the journey, right? So if you look at Pando's situation today, we might actually not have clarity on certain stages of, or we might think that, okay, it's happened a certain way till today, but, going forward, the way we do, for example, how we nurture leads when they have sort of fallen off a prospect funnel, right? At the top of the funnel, let's say we've reached out to a client and that has fallen off. We might, 6 months back, we thought the way we would nurture leads would fundamentally change. And so to nurture leads, we decided not to use webinars, right? On the other hand, to generate demand, we think the model is fairly scalable. We know exactly what we're talking about, who we are targeting, what the value proposition is. We would use webinars to accelerate the sales cycle. That was the first area where we started using webinars to influence the decision in Pando's, to Pando's side. That's one of the earliest pieces where we started using webinars and so on, right? So two things: you can use webinars wherever the hell you want to use webinars. It will be a learning journey where you'll figure out, what the success criteria is, how to tighten it, how to target it, how to create binge-worthy webinars where people are not bored out of their wits attending an online event and so on. But wherever you have clarity in terms of what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, I would then sort of craft webinars around it, right? So at a high level, that's sort of my framework for thinking about it.
Nitin, I'll come back to you. Lots of points you made on which I'm actually going to come back to you. But Gokul, I think I'll get a chance to ask only one question. But see, clearly there is no, as I mentioned earlier also when I introduced you, Gokul, there is no tool in the marketing kit bag that you have not used, right? From content to SEO to whatever. I'm actually trying to understand that where do the webinar-led I'm using it specifically for marketing in this context. Where does that stack up in the priority, and has it changed substantially in the last 15, 17 months since COVID has started?
Sure. Thanks, Alok. And Nitin, thanks a lot for setting up the stage over there. You covered a lot of it and pretty much I can build on that. Right. Yeah. So for the question, Alok, particularly, I would say that webinar, definitely the prioritization has changed in the last 2 years. Now, for us at Whatfix, we started webinars back in 2017, right? So it was not something which was new for us when the entire shift happened. Rather, it was more like we had to shift gears. And let's say, just backtracking again, we started events, physical events back in 2015 itself. Right from the get-go, we started exploring new events and going on that.
Right.
Now, so in a collective sense, we look at them as events, virtual and physical, which we look at in the current scenario as well. Now, physical events was always in the forefront till 2019. Webinar was in the backdrop, and suddenly we had to just cut down on the physical and accelerate on that sense, right? Now, the way we see it, webinar always augmented or helped in that nurturing sequence after a physical event or just pushing people to a physical event. So pre and post was where webinars was positioned. Now, when physical event got cut out of that mixture completely, we had to rethink it in such a way that, okay, can we look at it in different funnels stages, right? So top funnel, mid funnel, and bottom funnel, where can we use webinars and how can we educate people across the funnel using this particular channel, right? So that was a positioning that we had to look at. And in fact, the whole concept of webinars became much broader. It became virtual events as such. Right. So I think that would be a better context over there because there's so many different ways in which this can be utilized. And for us, I think in 2019, we were doing we did about 25 or 20 to 25 webinars. And in 2020, we doubled it to around 43, 45. In 2021, we are currently at around 65 plus virtual events. Right. So that's the scale which we are going at right now. And the reason particularly is, let's say, we figured out how it can work across multiple places in the funnel, right? Basic thing, it's education. How do you, let's say for somebody is completely a new prospect, how do you educate them about the particular brand or the particular concept that you're actually selling? So in terms of Whatfix, what is digital adoption all about? It's something that we're trying to increase that footprint over there. So that comes in the top funnel, any kind of conversation that happens there. Mid funnel would be a mix of education plus, let's say, a glimpse of what we do, right? Something more like you're showing what Whatfix does maybe for a last 5 minutes or 7 minutes across the entire session. And then bottom funnel is ultimately talking all about what Whatfix can deliver for you. So that is structured in different ways based on different funnel. Now that actually helped. This became a central piece for our entire marketing strategy because we started working things around it, right? So at any point of time, we had virtual events going on, right? And one more point to add there. Now, this is not just Whatfix conducted events as such, right? Now, we work alongside with third-party vendors. Now, that is much more in larger numbers comparatively. A basic reason being, let's say, Whatfix's database is not enough for obvious reasons when you're targeting different persona. And Whatfix itself targets on maybe L&D, HR, IT, PNC, different segments as such. Now, our database is not mature enough that, okay, we can market and get a humongous successful webinar out of it. So that's where these third-party vendors come into play, where they have a good foothold in that community, where we are actually creating content and educating their community. Now, that in turn becomes a top funnel or a mid funnel webinar for us, which we can nurture again with a mid or bottom funnel from Whatfix's side. Right. So that's a repeatable process which keeps on happening. And different variants and types of webinars also, right? I mean, there is webinars or panel discussions or interviews, as you call it. There could be, let's say, when there is a presentation-led webinars, or a mix of those, right? Or in a third party, it could be a virtual conference as such. Now, that's also another aspect which we kind of milked out as much as possible. Wherever there is a virtual conference, we have an access to these amazing event platforms there is. Right, where you can talk to people one-on-one virtually. The whole concept of meeting people physically, now that was taken into a virtual mode, and you can actually talk to them. Now, we trained our BDRs in such a way that they could actually make meaningful conversations with them, and actively tap onto a lot more context for that particular person. I mean, whoever we're talking to. Now that all the physical events, which is large, pretty much moved into the virtual conference based on a platform. Now, that was another aspect which came in, which evolved into the virtual events, which took us by large. So yeah, to answer your question, it has become a central piece now. In fact, it's a layer which is continuously working, generating demand and generating revenue for us. Now, so the way I see it, virtual events is one layer which keeps on going, irrespective of how we come back or bounce back from the whole hybrid scenario right now. Physical events would be another layer on top, and hybrid would be the medley which keeps on happening. So it's going to be a consistent thing. ABM, marketing automation, let's say the regular content aspects, influencer marketing, all of them are circles around it, which keeps on contributing or taking it from them. It's mutually, let's say, symbiotic in a way.
Got it. No, this is very helpful, Gokul. I'm again going to come back to you, assuming I get airspace in between. I do want to open it up at this point in time. As I mentioned, you can raise your hand. You can type a question in the Q&A panel if you would like. Either is fine. And given that now the topic is also introduced, if some of you actually have expertise in this space, please don't be shy. Just put your hand up and we'll actually bring you in the panel, not just to ask a question, but even to answer questions. So feel free to be there. And while some of you are still sort of deciding what question to ask and when to come, I do want to chime in, unless Arpit, I can see you want to chime in first, so you go ahead.
I've been meaning to ask one question, and Nitin and Gokul, this is actually, for both of you, not directed specifically at anyone. What changes by ACV in maybe how, in the format of the webinar, how many people you invite, how long should it be, pre-event, post-event, etc. Like, would just love to understand that. And sorry, just by ACV, I'm generally using that as a proxy for the kind of customer we are going after. SMB versus enterprise, for example, would be one demarcation I would think about.
I can go first. So, ACV, you're right. In some sense, it is a demarcation. So I would sort of put this in two buckets, right? I think, and actually, a Whatfix versus Pando is an interesting comparison.
Yes.
So there is a mature markets where identifiable buyer persona, independent of user persona. So Pando's, let's say, started in the TMS market, which is a known market, and supply chain leaders are our buyers. And the supply chain team, generally, and not the supply chain leader, is the user, right? It's a clear sort of demarcation. And the same supply chain leader also buys other supply chain tools. It could be a warehouse management system, it could be a supply chain planning system, and so on and so forth. And there's a broader sort of gamut of things that they buy. That's on one side, right? Mature markets with identifiable customer personas. I'm assuming, and I'm taking the liberty to say this, Gokul, so correct me. I'm sure I'm somewhere in the ballpark, not accurate. But for emerging categories like digital adoption, right, where earlier it was not a category that was very well defined, but it's an emerging category that is being defined. Let's say the target persona is anybody, let's say the project manager who's implementing Salesforce at manufacturing companies in North America, for instance, is the buyer persona, for instance, right? Now, I would sort of look at this in that comparison, and I think ACV plays a role there, right? As sort of a distributor there, right? From Pando's perspective, ABM is sort of the campaign strategy that we are essentially using, right? So let's say named account list of, and let's take one category, CPG accounts in North America, Midwest North America, and what we define as mid-market, which is $500 million to $3 billion in revenue range, for instance, right? So we take a named account list of 1,000 accounts, for instance. Now, reality is that at least research points to outbound SDR motion with a little bit of brand air cover should yield about 50 to 60% of pipeline in a mature market with an identifiable customer persona. So most of our investments go into pick up the phone and call the damn guy, tell him what the value proposition is, and he whether today or tomorrow he's going to convert into a client, because it's only a question of sort of whether his budgets are aligned, etc. But he will. There is a real need, and you know who you're talking to, right? But the reality is that from 1,000 accounts, if let's say forget the exact numbers, but just to make a point, let's say this 1,000 through my funnel becomes 500, 100, I close 50 deals this quarter, right? Now, most of our SDR and marketing or sales and marketing bandwidth and investment is going into the 50 accounts we're closing, the conversion number, right? The 950 accounts that have fallen off the funnel in different parts of the piece, generally, you put them on what you call a nurture campaign, right? And a nurture campaign is generally put them on another email campaign or put them on another SDR campaign or whatever else, right? Or a digital campaign and so on, right? The reality is, why do people fall off the funnel? Generally is not because they don't have the pain, because ABM generally is qualified at the account list level itself, right? So generally they will always have the pain. And you would always also know that they don't have any other tool that's already implemented. So it's only a question of, look, this is not priority right now. I'm going to do it 2 quarters later, or I'm going to do it 4 quarters later, right? Yeah. So let's say this quarter, it all falls off the funnel. One of the big things that we use webinars at Pando for is to actually nurture that funnel, that part of the funnel that falls off, right? Because reality is next quarter, if I pick up the phone and call the same guy again and say the same thing again, my product is not changing every quarter. His context is not changing every month either, right? It at least takes 2 quarters or 1 quarter or one or whatever the timeline is for him to actually change the context and be ready for Pando, right? In the interim time, if we don't nurture him with something that is outside a sales message, right? Either he gets annoyed or he just stops responding to you, right? And there isn't a clear sort of nurture conversation that essentially drives, right? So from my perspective, I think wherever there is ABM, mature market, clear identifiable buyer persona, and buying decisions that generally, if you look at the buying decision for Pando, it's under a quarter, right? But when they're actually buying. But if you look at the nurture funnel, it would actually be a year. You would have been nurturing the damn account for a year, but when they decide to buy, they'll buy within a quarter, right? So it is for that nurture time period, which I presume will be much longer for companies like Pando, where we end up using a lot of webinars to educate them and talk about what we're driving, right? That's the way we think about it.
Actually, Gokul, will be useful to get your perspective, because Whatfix has 10 to 20K accounts also and $1 million accounts also.
Plus, yeah.
You span the entire spectrum. And how do you think differently as you do this categorization of accounts and how you use webinars with them?
Yep, absolutely. And two sides, definitely. One is the named account aspect, the outbound aspect. And the other is, let's say medium intent aspect. So let's say if I'm putting virtual events, it would be in the middle. So where inbound is a high intent and outbound is low intent, webinar or virtual events would be somewhere in the middle, right? Where you are educating the person, whoever is actually joining in for such virtual events, know that, okay, there is something like this, there is a solution which could possibly help me, but they might be interested to learn more about it. But, they have to reach out and go for the next steps to understand that, right? But yeah, they are not completely averse to the idea at all, right? Like when it's outbound, it's completely different. Now, so we see a mix definitely based on what we want to achieve. We go for specific virtual events as well. So let's say in terms of named accounts or ABM campaigns, we do have specific roundtables that we look at, or we do invite people for specific events which could include only those accounts. It could also be a virtual lunch and learn session, which can involve accounts from a specific region, and just those people. So that one would be warming up those outbound accounts as well and introducing them and bringing that intent over there. On the broader spectrum, again, it's very hard to control because we have always gone in the let's increase the footprint more rather than just going laser targeted. And that has worked for us because you're tapping onto the community again and again till that message actually gets through, right? So let's say, for example, one of the communities. So L&D, I'll take L&D for example, learning and development. Now, learning and development has been a very successful, in the virtual events aspect for us. Now, we've worked with so many different vendors in learning and development community, where we are doing several events with them on a consistent basis. So this could be webinars, this could be the virtual conferences that they host. So we are trying to hit the same subset of people again and again, where the brand awareness is also happening. Plus, we are trying to channel them or make them, get educated about Whatfix multiple times. And then they are well aware. It comes into our bucket where we are actually hosting maybe our virtual events in terms of a webinar, or we have done a couple of larger summits as well. Digital Adoption Summit was something that we did last year. Now, those places, there is a credibility building that happens. There's a lot more relevance and value that is given over there. And that actually warms them up to a level where they're open to more conversation and understanding, right? So this is how the connection happens. Now, in terms of an ACV aspect, let's say definitely more towards the outbound angle rather than the inbound. And there is mix for sure, but we are able to nurture any enterprise that comes in there, because that multiple concepts come in again and again, and we are able to hit more than one person in such a scenario, right? You get one person within an account, you have a possibility that with using the ABM campaign itself, you can actually tap onto the other people saying that, okay, this is what this person actually spoke about from this account, right? So it opens up a lot more doors in that way, which gives us a better longevity.
Hey, just one quick pointer. When Gokul said L&D as a community, right? It's an interesting point. I think defining, sort of segmenting the market in some sense into, let's say, L&D, let's say Workday under the HR ecosystem and L&D under that, right? As a category. And that segment of the market would have specific targeted, let's say, webinars or events for nurturing, right? Under the CRM ecosystem, Salesforce customers will probably have a different set of, and so in Pando's context, for instance, that is CPG customers that have SAP clients in the upper mid-market, for instance, right? Similarly, manufacturing businesses that are Oracle customers in the enterprise segment, for instance, right? So each of these might have slightly different, the way they approach it, what you need to educate them on, how much you need to educate them on, the way you nurture them, etc., would be different, right? So when we say webinar, generally also it's a very specific conversation with who you are talking to, right? And generally who you're talking to your point, Arpit, in terms of the ACV increase, the target market will become more and more defined as the ACV increases. Right? And so it would not be a 1:many conversation. It would be 1:, fewer in the context of that who you're talking.
Got it. Maybe I'll take one question now from Vivek Ganeshan here. And Vivek, your question is certainly not silly. It was also on our list of questions. I'm going to while he has asked sort of, do you have a suggestion for the tool choice to host webinars? But as you think about just conducting online events and webinars, would be just good to understand what does a tech stack for that look like? And if you're particularly, I understand that both of you have, your companies have grown substantially now, but if you think from the perspective of an early stage entrepreneur today, what kind of tool sets might you use which can be cost effective and yet be good tools for them to use?
I think Zoom is the easiest and the cost effective one, right? Zoom also has a webinar version. This one, what we are on right now, is a webinar version, right? I mean, right. So generally the Zoom meeting, which is always used for, let's say, if it's a smaller discussion, maybe roundtable or something like that, where you need more flexibility, just the regular Zoom meeting account would be good enough. Or you could upgrade for the Zoom webinar. I mean, that would be the cheapest comparatively. much more, let's say the ones which we use GoToWebinar as well as Zoom in both cases. GoToWebinar gives us a little bit more control because we use marketing automation tool, which is Pardot. There's a lot of better integration over there. That's the reason. But again, yeah, I mean, for early stage startup, I think that's good to go. There's a lot of tools like Demio, Big Marker. There's plenty of tools which keeps on popping up.
Livestorm.
Yeah, Livestorm, yes. Right. So it's ultimately what the requirement that you need and the integration that you need. If both of them works, I think that's where you go.
I just because we're defining webinars as slightly broader concept, Alok, rather than just this kind of a webinar. One of the things that's worked beautifully for Pando is Loom videos, right? Where let's say and I'm talking further down the funnel. Let's say generally at least in our world at Pando, deals used to happen meeting to meeting, right? So it was field sales, and a salesperson would go meet a customer, and there would be a bunch of conversations that I had for an hour, and they'd say, okay, let's meet next Friday. And then next Friday they would meet, and nothing would happen in between, right? Because the meeting is scheduled for next Friday. And if you do weekly catch-ups, the only thing that was there to update was, oh, I'm meeting the guy next Friday, right? So, the minute sort of this online, COVID hit, etc., what we started doing was, these were 30-minute meetings a lot more frequently. But what we realized was, in a meeting, this is synchronous, right? We're talking to each other in real time. Yeah. But between two meetings that are synchronous, you could have multiple asynchronous touch points, right? Where, for instance, I'm talking to you today, and let's say there is a bunch of questions that have come up, or maybe I feel like when I'm doing my homework after the meeting, I realized that I could have answered a question better, or you seem to be uncomfortable or unsure about one specific aspect of my product, or one particular feature I couldn't demo right, or whatever, right? I would essentially shoot out a Loom video to you, which would be 1 to 2 minutes long, that would essentially specifically answer one particular question, right? Now, the power of that Loom video is really strong, right? I've actually used customers to answer a question for a prospect about a recommendation. So when I tell a customer that I've got a customer, I've got a prospect that's struggling with figuring out, what the top 10 things they should consider when they're looking at a TMS is. And I know you've done this before. Can you just do a Loom video for me that just a minute long that I can share with them to in turn sort of drive the process forward, right? Yeah. So there are very diverse ways in which you can do this to influence your overall marketing or sales process. And Loom has been particularly great for us both externally and internally. Even for example, I do a sales meeting and then I need to update my pre-sales team on it, or my customer success team on it just before handoff to customer success. The sales guys are asked to sort of do a quick Loom video to in turn hand it off to customer success in the handover between marketing to sales in the MQL to SQL stage, or from sales to sort of customer success in the onboarding stage as well, right? So that's another tool that's worked really well for us.
Wow, that's quite amazing. That's quite amazing.
One follow-up question on that one. Hey, sorry, Gokul, go ahead.
No, it's super cost effective. Loom is free, and I think the first version is around $8 or something. Yeah. $8 or $10, something around that. Yeah.
Nitin, since you mentioned, how you use customers to answer some questions in Loom. Actually, one other question which I was trying to understand in these webinars that we are doing, right? And this may be perhaps more relevant for, let us say, enterprise folks, but is there a way to seamlessly insert customers, maybe as experts, saying, here's a case study, but instead of us telling you about the case study,
there's a customer who can talk about it.
Here's a customer who can talk about it, something like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, again, it depends on the way I sort of, and this has helped me sort of think through what we're using webinars for, right? And Gokul's probably an expert in this. I'm learning this. The way I sort of think about marketing for SaaS is sort of, there is brand identity, there is positioning, there is value proposition, and then your campaign, right? So you sort of, I look at it at least as a inverted sort of funnel, if you would, right? Or inverted this thing where your campaigns are razor specific, right? So when, Gokul's talking about top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel content, he's talking about one specific category or one specific named account list where they're running a specific campaign around, let's say, learning and development folks to in turn sell a Workday user adoption or digital adoption platform for Workday customers, right? So that's a very specific targeted piece. You could also do this at a brand level, right? Which is to say, generally supply chain digitization I want to talk about. right? And maybe this is a customer that is, done a great job and is not yet a customer of Pando's, and maybe they won't be for the next 2 years because they've just implemented something and they're maybe struggling with one specific aspect. So not just positive webinars that are reinforcing your message, but negative aspects of why the alternative world is probably not going to work is also something that we've used this for, right? So in that 4-step piece, you can actually use it for either positive or negative reinforcement, right? The second piece is actually, we have always said in any webinar or online event, there has to be at least one customer and one prospect, right? Let's not do this as a general, anybody in supply chain talking to anybody in supply chain, for instance, right? There's got to be one person who's sort of strongly talking about Pando and one person who's considering on the fence or probably on the other side, right? So, a lot of times, even if you don't say, let me talk about a case study about Pando, for example, right? If you put a Pando customer in front of 10 others who are not Pando customers and they're talking supply chain, they would invariably mention it that, this problem that you're talking about, we solved it with Pando in this way, right? And that becomes a lot more organic in the way these comments sort of get exchanged between them, right? At least we have not had a great experience doing the last 5 minutes, let me do a quick demo or a quick case study, etc. Right? We've generally, the way we've done it is to send it out in chat, for example, or do it as a follow-up to the webinar, or send them a quick, or in the last 2 minutes of the webinar, tell them, look, everybody who's participated, appreciated, we're going to send you a quick, case study of Pando as a follow-up, and not for the webinar itself, because it seems a little, people have come for a specific reason. It would be helpful for them to sort of stay for that reason, right? And don't want to come off as selling too hard to them as well.
Actually, Arpit, I want to add to Nitin's comment on this. See, if you look at this notion of having a customer speak on your behalf and inviting other people, it can actually be used at different stages of the funnel. So at least I remember, and I'm, of course, what I'm talking was used to be physical, but there is no, I'm assuming all that physical today happens on a webinar. It can actually simultaneously be used for different stages of the funnel, which is that, again, let's take an example, right? That process industry is a large vertical for SAP. Now you want to get head of a plant, head of a chemicals plant, to talk about how have they actually really used SAP? What has it changed? How difficult has it been? How have they circumvented those problems? You now want to create what we used to call a customer day, effectively. But that, of course, now happens online, is that you get this person to speak about it, invite other people. Now, what actually works very well is that you can invite different people who are at different stages of the funnel also. Understood. There might be somebody who are actually trying to close a deal in Q3 today. And you know that your champion is there, they have ticked a few boxes, but they need a few reference points to be able to do the documentation on their side before the CFO signs off on it, right? It helps them on that side. On the other hand, this might be the beginning of a new cycle for somebody else as well. And what in general one has realized is that I think in enterprise software, because these are complex beasts that need to get implemented, what you see is not what you get. You're buying a promise. What it'll come out at the end of, after you have written the check, is actually not very clear, which is why from a risk mitigation perspective, people want your customers to speak on your behalf in these things. So it helps a lot in doing those, but at least I have seen a mixture of different stages of the funnel also being used in the same event actually quite effectively in the past. I'm going to take a question from one of the attendees who is signing in as an anonymous attendee. And his question is that, or her question is that, webinars are again an operation intensive process. Is there any way to reduce or shrink the operational funnel of the webinar? Sounds like this person is tired of the of the execution complexity, which is, by the way, true. And are there any sort of best practices that you guys can actually lay out, saying that, look, this is what will make it more repeatable and easier to execute?
Yeah, I'll take a jab on that. So we've done, as I mentioned, around 60 plus virtual events this year. And so we know the pain for sure. I think the operational aspect, it's more like figuring out what works that, let's say there are few nuances, which is always the same, right? It's all about, it's a copy paste in many cases, right? You have landing pages created, create templates for that. You have let's say the webinars, if you're putting in different funnels, again create templates for that. Content becomes again a templatized thing. So we try to have as many templates as possible, so it becomes more predictable, and you just have to make minor tweaks to do it again and again. So let's say, for example, let's say if we create one presentation for a specific webinar, we tend to go back and build on that presentation or reuse that presentation in different communities or different stages, right? So you don't really have to go back and do that. And we work alongside with the product marketing team to do this. So it doesn't make sense to go back again for even minor changes. It's just trying to add more problems over there, or more time consumption over there, right? So those things, if you can templatize it, it becomes much more easier. In terms of setting up and everything, it's pretty much the regular process. You have to do it. It's just, you have to get that finicky thing. Is it all right? I mean, it's not like, okay, you set up a time and yeah, I mean, if there are some screw ups again, that becomes into a larger scale problems as such. So those things, don't try to find any workarounds over there. Let that be the constant struggle which is there. Then in terms of the marketing aspect, now marketing again, banners or let's say the specific marketing list that you have, again, if you can make sure that these are the ones that you want to tap onto on a regular basis. Try and arrange it for each segment or each funnel attribute you want to actually add. These are the ones that you want to target and tap onto again and again. So let's say it's all about planning ultimately. Once you set up the plan and templatize maximum aspects of it, it becomes much more easily doable and predictable ultimately. So we generally backtrack around from a webinar to back to 45 days. So 45 days is our time frame that we set for doing the webinar. And promotions, earlier we used to do it for a longer period of time. Now we have seen that 2 weeks promotion is good enough. That's when people actually remember and show up for the webinar, right? Otherwise, if it's earlier, then generally people don't really, we have seen many people re-register as well, right? They just forget that they actually registered for a webinar in the first place. I hope.
Or just get somebody like Gokul. But jokes apart, I think it's a real struggle, right? Especially when you're doing the 0 to 1. A lot of the minute I heard that question, the first thing that hit me was, we're talking about sort of scaling a model that is working vis-a-vis, like, if I've never done webinars before and you're sort of doing it for the first time, it can be daunting, right? So one thing that worked for us, and this is where we were 12 months back, right? We'd never done webinars before, and then we started doing it. One thing that's worked for us is we specifically took only one category of problem statement, right? Take one category of customer, one sliver of your funnel, right? Which is, it could be, I want to generate more leads, tightly define your problem statement. I want to generate more leads out of these 100 named account lists in CPG in India in the enterprise segment, for example, right? Or whatever that means for you, right? And essentially say, what is it that I can talk about or create an online virtual event for that can be exciting for these folks, right? And while you go on to execute that within a 30-day timeline or a 45-day timeline, what we also did was we had one other person who was not involved in sort of putting together this webinar, figure out if this problem statement was, you change one variable for, let's say instead of CPG, it was chemicals or process industry, or instead of enterprise, it was mid-market, or if instead of top of the funnel, it was middle of the funnel, for example, right? Change one variable in this and say, we're not going to do 2 webinars at the same time, but what are the things that we are doing for this webinar that I can collateralize or standardize in a way that if I was doing multiple at the same time, then I could then sort of use it there, right? Because generally you're iterating in some sense, right? You're doing this for the first time. You just want to get this one right and then think about the future. And that's the right thing to do because, you're getting off the ground. But if you had one other person essentially thinking about how can I make this process repeatable for the future, and just collateralize a bunch of these things and make them assets, create a process for how to run a webinar, a playbook for how to run a webinar for this problem statement, you can then, at least for that problem statement with only one variable that is changing, run at least the next 10 webinars decently well, right? And you will continue to learn along the way, right? So that is sort of how we started our first journey of 0 to 1 in the framework.
Got it. I want to take up a question. I mean, you use the phrase, Nitin, 0 to 1. and I'm tempted to ask a question that Somnath has now asked. So Somnath, by the way, is an entrepreneur I respect a lot. He's building a company called Prism Force, and they are targeting classical mid-market to large enterprises in the tech and professional services space. They're out of the stealth mode. They are doing their first few pilots. And again, he believes that the first 5 to 10 clients will be at the back of their prior relationships and clients, right? Because this is classical large enterprise motion. At what scale do you start thinking seriously about marketing, thought leadership-led webinar type intervention? And do you think that too many webinars can also eat up a lot of the founder's time in initial stages of the evolution of a company? Essentially, at what stage do you begin to use this tool in the first place?
I can take a jab at that. I used to very strongly think that it was a distraction, right? I now think the opposite in the early stage, right? And the entrepreneur who slapped me in the face and told me and talked sense into me was Shri at Rocket Lane, right? And where essentially entry into a new market where they were still defining the product, figuring out what problems they wanted to solve and not solve. A year before they released the beta version of the product, they had started doing webinars, podcasts, and building a community around onboarding of a new customer, right? And that was the pre-0 to 1 journey, right? This was, they had, at least I think that even before they had raised seed capital, they had started building community and content around, which was essentially webinars, because he started in January and March, I think, was when COVID hit. So through the last 18 months, is when they sort of built the community itself, right? So now I actually believe that the answer is, even for Pando, for instance, we are now entering a new market, right? And in that market, we believe that there is about 60 to 70% product market fit. So in some sense, that 0 to 1 journey for us in the new market is the journey that we're going through. We're actually building community and content and webinars before we enter the market, rather than thinking about it as an afterthought later, right? So I actually think you should do it much earlier than at least Pando did it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. So I think it's not about the time essentially, because ultimately doing a webinar is easy, but promoting it is always the biggest problem there, right? How do you promote it? So yeah. What we have seen generally is a database is very much required, because that's the biggest chunk of promotion that you get, right? Email marketing, it still works. Marketing automation, if you can drive majority, I mean, even for us, even now, our marketing automation team drives the maximum amount of registrations. Now for early stage, that's difficult to have, right? On the other side of it, let's say another possibility, I mean, if at all you have any budget for it, if there are established third-party vendors on the community or the segments that you're targeting, now they will have a database which you can tap onto. I mean, again, you're anyway spending a lot of time in outbound, you're spending in multiple places. So if you're tapping onto that community and trying to hit the right kind of persona there, now that would actually go for a longer way, because you're creating a presence there. And then maybe as a follow-up, you could do a webinar of your own, which could nurture it and bring it down the funnel, right? Now that would have a much more impactful journey as well for the person who's seeing your product for the first time or hearing about for the first time. And we've been trying to reciprocate this across each domain or segment that we keep targeting from Whatfix. Like recently, we started targeting property and casualty insurance. And there are some specific accounts, like we do have some customers there, but we want to go deeper there. Now, the whole idea was we tied up with Reuters, which is a giant in that particular segment. And this started helping us get headway over there and get more conversations. And interestingly, Reuters hosted us with 2 other panel speakers, which in turn, within a month, the 2 other panel speakers became an opportunity. Right, they became a prospect ultimately. And that again added, whoever visited again came into the bucket later on. Right, so that's much more impactful compared to doing our own webinar, because it's very hard to find that success initially.
Actually, Gokul, I think for the benefit of people who are attending this webinar, I guess, it'll be useful.
Not just any webinar, though.
Yeah, not just any webinar though. But what you just talked about, what's the kind of cost? Let's say you're using a Gartner or a Thomson Reuters or someone else, because I think it'll be useful, because at least even I don't have a view on whether this is going to cost me $20,000, it's going to cost me $100,000. I don't know.
It varies definitely based on the persona. I mean, higher you go, expensive it's going to be, right? So let's say if you want to go for a larger pool, let's say a manager or influencer level folks. So when we see it as the people who you want to hit. Let's say there is decision makers. There are the C-level complete executives. Let's say director plus would be decision makers for us, and anywhere between manager to director would be an influencer level, who doesn't have a direct potential to buy, but can influence into this thing, right? So ultimately, when you're looking at it for a larger pool, it's always less expensive. Maybe around 5-10K average, you can actually do a webinar with them. You will get a larger lead list compared to the rest of it, and let's say depending upon the vendor that you're working with, the third-party vendor for your particular segment. And when it goes to a expensive thing, would be a director plus interaction. So there are multiple variants to that as well. If you could do a roundtable with a director plus activity, right? That could actually give you a long way. Can give you a very good deal out of it, particularly. But again, it'll be maybe 20-30K on an average. And just to add there, we work majorly into the enterprise segment. So again, the price actually varies over there. For SMB segment, it would be comparatively lower as well.
Hey, I just want to make sure Somnath gets his answer. So this is a targeting tech and professional services companies, I'm assuming, in the US or globally. Let's say, for instance, you were to, Somnath, take SAP's partner list in India or partnered list in North America. That's actually very easy to get. And the database, that's the database that you're talking about, right? Which is the top 100 or tier 2 partners, because you're saying 100 million to 2 billion. SAP's partner list or Workday's partner list in North America. And then to essentially pick 5 out of those, reach out to them to then do a targeted sort of closed door session, to understand what's going on in the context of your product as an open discussion. 9 out of 10 people, when you're not selling something to them, generally want to come give gyan, right? And so they're willing to come talk to you about and talk to their peers about, as sort of an industry leader in furthering, their personal brand as well, right? So the way I would probably do this to sort of make sure that founder time or founder efficiency is maximized is just take, tier 2 SAP partners in North America, pick the 5 of them out of that are most active on LinkedIn, reach out to them, ask them to come into a closed door session where you're not partnering with anybody, or let's say, you're partnering with one of them. The first one that's essentially said yes, you're partnering with them, and then essentially doing this as a closed door roundtable session, right? A lot of the snippets or the voice notes from that or video notes from that can actually be used as reusable content in the future as well, right? So this person said this, and he is very similar to her, who's a prospect in my funnel, can actually be a massive force multiplier as well. So using webinar content as content that is reusable for your funnel is also something that becomes much easier. It can also feed into giving your team in the early stage more context and visibility about the market problem that they're addressing, right? Oftentimes you're very focused as founders on, and I did that as well, right? I said no to all the customers who won't buy my product in the first year, right? And so we never heard from the customers that, had already solved the problem on how they had solved it. And this becomes a good way to sort of build that culture early on.
Nitin, you have no idea, but Somnath just sent me a mail. He wants to hire you while you were promoting Gokul. But Somnath wants to hire you now. Guys, we have only 5 minutes left, so we'll do the next couple of questions. I'm in a slightly more rapid fire thing. A question that Gitanjali has asked and one more person has asked is that, in general, how do you make a webinar stand out? Because people are tired. Another person asked that many people register, they don't show up. So what do you do to make your webinar stand out, make it more attractive, make sure that the sign up to participation rate is actually high? What do you do?
You should definitely drill down on your persona first, because it's a KPI of the persona. I mean, let's say if you can give answers to the problem statements that they have with a webinar, then they will actually attend your webinar. Right. So it's ultimately the positioning of your content, which will actually help them solve the problem. First is that. Second is the speaker that can come to it. Right. So let's say if you have access or the network and there are some influencers in the space who can possibly come on board and maybe give more gyan to the people. That's the best thing possible, because they look up to such people, and any kind of let's say knowledge coming out from them will go a longer way than just you hosting the webinar, right? I mean, yeah, rapid fire. So I'll stop there.
Got it.
One small answer. I think don't talk about your product. It's generally the things that you want to talk about are not the things that your persona wants to talk about at all, right? They want to generally talk about something broader or something adjacent. And so at least our formula has been, don't talk about the product and make the person the hero, right? And if you're able to crack that intersection of, I'm going to make you a hero, and that's why you need to come. And you're a hero to others, and therefore others will come behind you. So if you're able to sort of figure the basic personality of that out, because just like how the audience is tired of webinars, the organizers are tired of the webinar, the speakers are also tired of the webinar. So if you're able to sort of solve for all three together, in some sense, it would work.
Yeah, ultimately value. You have to give value. That's about it.
Got it. Krishna and Ameo both have asked a similar question, which is, how do you know whether a webinar was successful in terms, and essentially the question behind the question is, what's a metric that you measure? Ameo also said that, look, what's a benchmark for number of attendees to MQL? And by the way, is that the right metric to look at, or is there a different metric that you should be focused on? And are there any sort of thumb rules that one would say, look, this was successful versus this was not successful?
Guys, I think for most things in marketing, at least and I keep getting told this from my team, which is, give it time. Don't jump from one shiny thing to another, right? I think that's really true for webinars as well. I think you just have to give it some time for you to get better at it till it starts yielding some results. Point number one. Point number two, I think it depends on what the tightly defined problem statement is, right? And especially when you're doing this 0 to 1, I would hyper define it. CPG companies, India, all of that stuff that we spoke about, and then say, define success upfront and define it over a period of time. I'll do 3 webinars, I'll get better at it. And out of these 100 accounts, I want at least 4 to start conversations with me, or 20 to start conversations with me, right? And see how that yields. And generally, so I wouldn't do it for one webinar. I wouldn't do it, for too broad a problem statement. The metric would essentially have to be for one very tight problem statement over a few of these events together.
Yeah, and in the marketing funnel, let's say, divide who you want to tap onto. That will ultimately show you better results. If you're doing a top funnel, keep it more generic. If it is mid or bottom funnel, there you can actually squeeze in a little bit of your product as well, which you will get potentially higher conversions as well.
But none of you want to hazard a guess on attendee to MQL. What's a good number, or is it
very subjective? Because it's a medium intent activity as such, right? It can vary. It's very subjective.
I'll turn that upside down actually, Alok. I would say, let's assume a situation where you don't care about, and I encourage our sales team to do this all the time, right? Which is, let's say you have, and you mentioned this, at the bottom of the funnel, you have somebody who's suddenly asking the question, is this a problem I want to solve right now, right? And that happens all the time in enterprises, right? And at that stage, we essentially say, turn this upside down to say, you are God, right? The world wants to hear from you about why you should be solving, companies like you should be solving this problem. I want you to just come talk to the rest of the world about why you should be solving this problem, right? And to hell with the audience, you can also hide like participants in this, right? Maybe they're talking to themselves, it doesn't matter, right? So 100% conversion rate could essentially be a bottom of the funnel customer giving gyan to, hopefully eventually the rest of the world, because this is a recorded content and that can then be peddled across the world, but could essentially then reiterate to themselves. And there's nothing as powerful as that. And this is as qualified as one can get, but then the conversion is going to be 100%, right? But it's true that if you're at the top of the funnel, at the middle of the funnel, new market entry, all of this stuff, it's medium intent. You can never sort of say, I'll continue doing it if it is 20%, if it's less than 20%, I'm going to stop. I think it's not the right way to measure.
Got it. I know that we always promise that we'll end on time. So it is 6 o'clock. We will end it here. And I want to thank, first of all, both Gokul and Nitin for being generous with your time and your views and participating today. And thank you to all the people who joined as well. Please do keep pinging us on topics that you would like to see covered in this. That helps us a lot rather than us guessing. I know some of you have been actually very generous with that also, but please keep that coming for future as well. Hopefully we'll see you again in 2 to 3 weeks.
Right.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you so much.